My guest today is Pete Williams, retired NBC News correspondent and JCU journalist in residence. Over a career spanning decades, Pete covered some of the most consequential moments in American public life, from the Supreme Court to breaking national news. And he knows what makes a story land and also what makes it disappear. So today we're going to talk about the practice of discernment, of pausing, reflecting, and getting honest about what something really means. It's at the heart of every story worth telling. And what he's learned applies far beyond the newsroom. Pete, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure. Always great to be with you.
Well, so we tell stories every day in lots of settings. You got to tell many on the news. And, without even realizing it, some who do this really well, they're often, doing it in a way that sort of has a consistency across all the stories that they're telling. They kind of know what they're trying to say in advance, right? And they also know why it matters. So I want to open by asking you, when you were covering a story, how would you figure out what the story actually was, and where did you start?
Well, sometimes figuring out what it actually was is pretty easy. Mm-hmm. If it's an event, a speech, a policy change, a shooting, a bombing, a court decision, then basically what you're doing is the classic journalism 5 W's: who, what, why, when, where, and also how. And the story really is then the facts and laying them out. It becomes more of a story when you add what it means. And sometimes there's a way of telling stories that add more context. For example, let's say you were doing a story on the rise in gasoline prices because of the war in Iran. You could do a simple story saying how the shortage affects oil prices at the pump, and you could do it kind of globally that way. Or you could look at the opposite end of the telescope. Start with a florist, somebody who has to deliver flowers and drive a lot with a van, and talk about how rising oil prices, more expensive gasoline, affects their bottom line. Or you might talk to a mother who has to drive her children long distances to school. It's a different kind of approach, but in both cases, really, when you're doing a news story, the facts are king.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure that you've had different contexts, different successes with which approach you start with. But the facts ultimately, you say facts are king. How do you kind of find the line between the facts and the story? And how do you know sort of when to lead with the facts, when to lead with the emotional appeal?
Well, for me as a journalist, the facts are the story.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get too far away from that. Journalism is the explanation of facts. Now, very often in commentary or opinion analysis, it's a different approach. But for me, as a reporter, my job is to tell a story. Mm-hmm. It's nothing more complicated than coming home at night and saying to your significant other or your roommate, "Guess what happened today?" That's really what journalists do. We tell you things that we think you didn't know, or that you're going to find that are interesting and that are new to you. And also we try to be a little bit, eat your vegetables. We in journalism try to tell you things that we think you ought to know, things that you ought to be concerned about. But when you're dealing with the facts, then really the goal is to arrange them in a way that holds the attention of, in television, the viewer, or the listener in radio, or the reader online or in a newspaper. And that was my form of storytelling for several decades. What events will I cover? Somebody once said that the essence of journalism is the process of selection. What stories will you cover? What facts will you marshal to tell those stories? What order will you put them in? Who will you interview to add expertise and context to the story? What pictures will you use? Literally, what words will you use to tell the story? Those are the sort of selection that goes into storytelling for a journalist.
So let's put this into practice. So you led with a hypothetical example of a story about rising gas prices. Mm-hmm. You've covered some really consequential news stories in your career. Can you think of one of them that it really was a story that you were proud of telling, and walk us through kind of how you put that advice into practice through that example?
Sure, and I will say that Don Hewitt of CBS News, who was the creator of 60 Minutes, one of the earliest producers of the CBS Evening News, used to say that his advice to his correspondents was, "Tell me a story." So it has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has to focus on people. It should begin with something vivid to hold the attention of the people who are going to see the story, and it should explain ideally why it matters, why you should care. The example I would give you is a story that I did for Dateline NBC, one of our primetime documentary programs. It was about a criminal case from World War II, a case that the George W. Bush administration was using as a legal precedent for why it should be able to put al-Qaeda terrorists on trial in military commissions in Guantanamo Bay instead of bringing them to the United States to regular civilian courtrooms. This involved the arrest of 8 Nazis who were sent to the United States in submarines, landed on the shore of America, carrying explosives with a mission to blow up American infrastructure, American factories, and to try to hinder the war effort. They were foiled because a National Guardsman who was walking on the beach in the northeastern part of the country off New York saw them and thought that was pretty strange and arranged for them to be arrested. The story gets a little more complicated than that because one of the Nazi saboteurs, his first words were, "I want to talk to J. Edgar Hoover," who was running the FBI, and he basically wanted to give up and explain and try to frustrate the ability of the Nazis to do what they did. But to tell the story, we actually found the FBI agent who first questioned this Nazi saboteur. This guy was 92 years old at the time, the FBI guy. And we took him to the hotel where he first questioned the agent, and he said that he was told that one of the Nazi saboteurs had a distinctive streak of gray hair. And he said, when I saw the guy with his gray hair streak, I knew that we had found the real guy. Eventually, it did lead to a trial of the Nazi saboteurs. They were given the death sentence. The guy who blew the whistle on the others was spared, went back to Germany, where he had a pretty tough life. He was not considered exactly a hero, even though by then, of course, Germany had forsworn the Nazis. But all of this was our attempt to make the history come alive. We found a lawyer who had worked for the White House, who was actually at the time a young lawyer in the Justice Department who worked on the trial. So we went to the scene where the Nazis came ashore, all those things to make the story, to make history come alive.
Wow, that's amazing. And I imagine that maybe one of the pitfalls with that approach, I'm guessing, and I want to make my observation and then ask you to react to it, is that perhaps leading with that story from history, you could, if not done well, lose sight of the meaning, which you were trying to tell a story also about Guantanamo Bay. So how do you make that link, and where might someone maybe lean too much on the information and not the meaning, or maybe not make that connection?
Well, the goal of the story was to say what the historical precedent was, that what the United States was trying to do with the al-Qaeda prisoners in Guantanamo was based on this historical precedent from World War II that we assumed that most Americans had never heard of.
Sure.
And that was really what the story was. Here's something I bet you didn't know, and to attempt to walk back through the history. So that was really the goal. The issue of whether the al-Qaeda prisoners should be tried in civilian courts or not was very much in the public mind. So this was really an attempt to back up a little bit and add some context and say, well, how did we get here?
That's certainly an important approach and an incredible way to help to educate. Back to your first point about eating your vegetables, right? And being able to help us put things into context. Pete, has there ever been a moment in your career where you felt like you got it wrong? You approached a story maybe in a way that didn't land or didn't work successfully to get to the meaning?
So got it wrong to a journalist means that you got the facts wrong.
Got it.
But that's not what you're asking about.
I'm asking about storytelling.
So I guess what you mean is there, did I fail to see the larger significance of the story? I guess the example I would use is this. When I first came to NBC, President Clinton, for his summer vacation, decided to go to the island of Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts. And I was assigned to Clinton pool duty, so I was the NBC reporter there. And I dutifully followed him around and reported on where he went and who he met and whose hands he shook and what he had for lunch and everything else. And when the story aired on nightly news, afterwards, Tom Brokaw, who was then the anchor, called me and he said, I think you missed the story. He said, I think the story was, because one of the things that Clinton did was get on a sailboat and sail around Martha's Vineyard with the wind in his hair and all that. And what Brokaw said is, you missed the story. This was Clinton trying to capture the Camelot magic of when John Kennedy was doing all of that around Massachusetts. It was very reminiscent of those images. And he said, I think you missed the broader story. So yes, I had the facts, but in the opinion of Tom Brokaw, and I have to admit that he was probably right, he thinks I missed the broader story.
Well, it's good to take that feedback from colleagues and friends and learn from it.
When the anchorman tells you something, it's more than feedback.
Yeah,
it's a command.
That's fair. That's fair.
It's like the president of the university,
Well, I'll keep in mind what that can do to folks. Oh gosh. Well, Pete, let's talk about what might get in the way of telling a good story, perhaps aside from missing the meaning. What do you think are some common mistakes people make when they're trying to tell a story, whether it's from a journalist chair or just in a professional setting? Whether they're a student talking about their internship or they're a professional who's pitching an idea, what might get in their way?
Well, I guess one thing would be piling the facts on. I think many people tend to think that facts in a story are like cash in the bank. The more you have, the better it is, and that's not always true. And if the goal is to persuade in addition to inform, then you have to explain why you want the listener or the viewer or whatever to do what you think they should do, why it's to their benefit, why it would help them, it would help them do a better job, it would help them be happier, it would help them contribute to humanity, it would be a good thing, it would be helping themselves. So if your goal is to persuade, you have to marshal the facts in a way that do that. And sometimes I think you can, miss the forest for the trees, as it were.
So you said something I think is very important, which is starting with a goal and understanding what you're trying to achieve. And I'm wondering how pressure or a deadline or a high stakes situation maybe can affect our ability to see a goal clearly.
Well, I think most storytellers are under pressure. Certainly daily journalists are under pressure. We have daily deadlines. The nightly news goes on the air at 6:30, and if you're not ready, your story doesn't go on the air. So that is a drop-dead deadline. I think the same is true for newspapers. I mean, there's a point when the presses run. The same is true for online websites, news sites. I mean, there's a point at which the story has to go. The same is true for lawyers. The same is true for authors. Authors have deadlines, even though they're longer, they're not daily, they're not by the hour. So pretty much everybody faces deadline. If you're going to speak to the Rotary Club, you better be there at noon on Tuesday when they meet and ring that little bell. So everybody faces a deadline, I think. And that's actually, I think, a good thing. It sort of focuses your attention. It means you have to get it done. And the more time you give yourself to meet that deadline, the earlier you start to tell the story and build your story, the better off you are.
I'm reminded of kind of the cliche, done is better than perfect, perhaps. And at some point, right, you've got to make a choice that you've got what you need or you've got as much as you're going to have, and you have to somehow make it work.
Yes.
Is there any advice that you might offer to our listeners as they're thinking maybe how do you sort of recognize when that is, or how do you make it work if you're just out of time? And did you ever have to manage that in a live situation where you would have loved to have had more, or with more time you would have done more?
Oh, well, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we were often called upon to, let's say that there's something unfortunate that happens in American life. Some guy walks into a shopping mall and starts shooting people. Well, then we begin live coverage. And so, you don't have the luxury of waiting. What you could do is come on the air and say, all right, there's been this incident, come back to us tomorrow, and then we'll have all the facts and we'll tell you what happened. Well, that doesn't satisfy the viewer. They want to know what's going on right now. So it's a bargain you make with the viewer. You say, all right, here's the deal. We will tell you the best information we have, but with the understanding that it may change. And then the goal is, I think, just to be transparent with the audience, to explain where your information is coming from. And then when things are updated, you have to be honest and say, all right, the first report said there were 2 people firing the shots. We now know that's not true. It's just a single man with a gun, and so forth. And that's true in any kind of breaking news situation. And by the way, when I was the spokesman at the Pentagon, it was the same kind of thing. There's an old expression in the military, first reports are always wrong. So again, you have to be transparent and honest and say, this is the best information we have. If you need 100% accurate, take it to the bank information, come back next week. But for now, we'll do the best we can.
Yeah, and it strikes me that breaking news is pretty consistent with just transparent leadership, right? I'm sure in organizations and in a variety of different settings, taking that approach as information comes across is
yes,
a
but
key
I will
thing.
say this. I mean, in those situations, you do have to be very careful with the information that you have and try to verify it and sort of follow the 2-source rule. Don't go with just a single source. I'll give you one quick example. Yeah. There was a shooting at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., a facility that on the shore, and the gunman was quickly subdued, and a word went out quickly of what the identity of the gunman was. We called, we had a name and an address, and we called that number. We found the phone number for that and called the number. And someone answered the phone. And so we figured, well, it's not that guy, it's somebody else. This guy had actually taken the ID that belonged to his brother and had his brother's driver's license. Fortunately, we didn't report that name. We held off on it. And so, in a breaking news situation, you have to be pretty careful.
Absolutely. Yeah, the stakes are high in those situations.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a bit about the structure of what makes a good story. You've talked about, the who, what, where, why, when of telling a story. Can you tell us a little more about sort of how instinct plays into creating the right structure of a story versus maybe something that's a bit more scientific?
Well, I suppose there are scientific ways to pull the story together. I've never known what that is, but sometimes it's chronological. You have a conventional lead. But sometimes the leads are anecdotal. In other words, instead of starting out by saying gasoline prices rose 30 cents at the pump today after the continuing problem in the Strait of Hormuz. Now that would be a conventional lead. An anecdotal lead would be to say, Mary Schwartz sells flowers in University Heights. And she's had to raise the prices on her flowers another $1 a dozen or whatever because of gasoline price. In other words, that's looking at it through a different end of the telescope. Mm-hmm. And so you can't lead every story that way. Sometimes you want to lead with a conventional lead, but there are, sometimes a different approach is always a good one. Yeah,
you're paying attention to context. You sort of are maybe mirroring your art in the situation by knowing the context. And what do you think is the importance of specificity? Why do details matter in helping someone paint the full picture of the story you're trying to tell?
Details matter because it's what these are the steps of the ladder that we hold on to when we're listening to a story. Winston Churchill, when he was the British Prime Minister in 1940, spoke to the nation, spoke to Parliament about the dark days ahead that he envisioned for himself as the leader, and he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." And yet we tend to remember that as blood, sweat, and tears. And why is that? Because blood, sweat, and tears are concrete things. Toil is an abstract concept. And so facts are vivid. Facts create a mental picture in your head. So they matter very much in telling a story. And you want to get as many facts in there as you can without, as I said, without letting them get in the way of the meaning.
So let's talk a bit about how you develop this storytelling instinct. So, you've done this for many years. You've gotten very good at it through a lot of practice. How would you advise folks who are trying to strengthen their skills in storytelling to go about developing this instinct or skill?
Do you play a musical instrument?
No, I do not.
Okay. Well, let's say
well.
it would be like asking someone, how do you develop the ability to play the piano well?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is practice.
Yep.
You know the old joke about how do I get to Carnegie Hall? So the way is do it. Just do it.
Mm-hmm.
Sit down and listen to somebody speak on television or on the radio or whatever, and then write a story about it. Take a story that's in the newspaper or on a news website and rewrite it. Think about something that happened to you in your day and write a story about it, and just keep doing it. The best way to learn how to do something is to do it. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing if you're trying to build a set of bookshelves. Practice. That there really is no better way to do it.
And how do you get better at asking good questions? So, a big part of your discovery of the facts in a story is knowing how to draw that out of people and those you're getting to know and approaching with the facts of the story, or to find the facts of the story. And it's striking me that can be something you practice every day if you put a framework around being curious. Any advice there?
Well, there are many approaches to interviewing people. Sometimes you're merely trying to get them to explain what happened. And your questions are no more, at essence, tell me what happened. Sometimes you have to guide them through it, and then what happened. And but it's just to get them to relate an experience. Sometimes you're trying to get them to explain something. And then you're almost their advocate, in that situation. You're trying to get them to be the best them that they can be. If they're a chemist or a physicist and they're trying to explain some physical process, you keep asking the question until you get them to be as clear as possible. So you're sort of their coach, if you will. Sometimes the questions are adversarial. Mr. Mayor, why did you do that? So your questions will depend on what your goal is. Are you trying to get them to explain something? Are you challenging them? Are you having a discussion of an issue? The questions are all going to be different based on that.
Yeah. And as I'm thinking, right, you're asking questions, you've got a goal in mind, you're listening. Talk to us a little bit about the difference between listening and talking, and maybe the relative importance of each in this process.
Well, when you're interviewing, you have to listen. Because you may have a set of questions, like we do, mm-hmm. but as you're doing right now, you're going to refine your questions, and you're going to do follow-up questions based on what the person just said. There's an old comedy routine of a duo named Bob and Ray, where it's clear that the interviewer is paying no attention to what the guest just said, because his next question will be to ask something that the guy has just answered. And so sometimes interviewers are like that. They just march lockstep through the questions they already had. That's not a very effective technique. You're having a conversation, really, and you want to try to make it as spontaneous as you can, and sometimes people will say something that leads you in a different direction. Yeah. So you have to be a good listener in the context of interviews.
Absolutely. And as we're talking about your career in journalism, how you tell a good story, and we're looking at ways that this idea of storytelling that you've honed through a long career in important rooms and talking with important people might translate to our listeners every day, right? How do you tell a good story in an interview? How do you tell a good story at the Thanksgiving dinner table? How do you use it to connect with people, right? There's probably some subset of those skills that link across many different contexts. And so we always like to wrap up these conversations by giving practical takeaways that maybe can go into practice right now or tonight. And I wonder if you might think about if someone's preparing, let's say, for a job interview right now, what's one thing from your experience that you think they ought to be thinking about that they could apply to that situation?
So we're back to what Don Hewitt said. Mm-hmm. Tell me a story.
Yeah.
Don't just tell me that you know how to use video editing software. Tell me how you used video editing software in creating a story about something that you covered. Don't just tell me that you did an internship or you were in the Peace Corps in Guatemala. Tell me what you did when you were in the Peace Corps in Guatemala. Make it interesting. Explain it in a way that you would tell your significant other, your roommate, your parents, whatever. Don't just recite the facts. Give me some meaning. Tell me a story. Make me want to care. We are at John Carroll University. This is a little academic, so let me quote a poem to you.
Perfect.
This is the poem that begins, "No man is an island." You've probably heard it, but let me just remind you what it says. It's short. "No man is an island entire of itself." And I should say, toward the end, it talks about the custom in English churchyards of sounding a church bell whenever anyone died. "No man is an island entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." And that's kind of a highfalutin way of just saying we're all in this together. Make me care. Tell me why I should care about you. That's the goal.
Ah, beautiful. And thank you for quoting literature. I was an English major, so I can appreciate that very much. Maybe just the last point here before we wrap up, Pete, is there's something of a personal story inside of each one of us. And, here we are at a university. We talk about helping students recognize that story in themselves. And a big part of articulating what you want to say to somebody about your story is sort of recognizing it. And, I think thinking of yourself as a bit of the subject of a story is something that we all ought to try to embrace. Do you have any thoughts or comment on that might help someone sort of turn inward and think about how their story matters?
Yeah, actually, I would say not turn inward so much as stand apart from yourself. Mm-hmm. So when you're telling your own story, you have to say, I'm now an advocate for this person that turns out to be me. Mm-hmm. It's not so much blowing your own horn, it's being objective about what makes you interesting. You have to kind of stand apart for yourself and say, what about me, what about this person who turns out to be me is really interesting and important that I want others to know. And that's what their goal really is.
Ah, beautiful. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about how to connect with others in a context that grabs their attention and helps them care, to learn about something that maybe they didn't know they ought to know. Your point of view on listening, on thinking about starting with a goal, the structure of a story, when to start, when to stop, right? We've hit a lot of topics, incling how we tell our own stories.
Who needs AI? You've just summarized the whole thing.
We did it, right? Call me Claude or ChatGPT. But I'm so glad to have had this conversation with you and for you to share some of your wisdom with our listeners. Certainly we've hit a lot of important points about what makes a great interview, what makes a great story. And thanks for helping us think about how we discern some of the choices we make in that process.
My pleasure, and thanks for letting me read a poem.
Of course. Always read poems. Thanks, Pete.
My pleasure.